Mitt Romney remains off the campaign trail as the DNC gets underway, but his running mate Paul Ryan was out today in key swing state of Ohio. Take a look.
Let's be very candid. President Obama inherited a difficult situation when he came into office. Here's the problem. He made things worse. He's run out of ideas.
The Romney team continues to hammer President Obama on the economy, and those attacks appear to be working. The latest NBC News Wall Street Journal poll shows more than half disapprove of his handling of the economy. Remember, nearly 13 million Americans are out of work. The unemployment rate is north of 8%. And we're bracing for another uncertain jobs report on Friday, the day after President Obama's big convention speech. History hasn't been kind to presidents when unemployment is above 6%. The only one in modern history to survive a bad economy was President Ronald Reagan. But back to President Obama and our poll. Nearly 6 in 10 Americans see him as a likable guy and an easygoing guy. You know, someone you want to grab a beer with. So what wins out come November, policy or personality? In the guest spot today, Associate Politics Editor for Roll Call, David Drucker, who's joining us from Charlotte. Hello, David.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. So I was reading through a New York Times piece from earlier in the year by a guy named Morris Fiorina. He is a professor at Stanford, and he did a study on this likability issue. And he looked specifically, among other elections, at 2000 and Al Gore's loss to George Bush. And a lot of people after that said, well, it had to be because he wasn't likable. He writes of Al Gore, among the postmortems, a prominent explanation for Gore's negative accomplishment was the personal one. Voters simply did not like him. Gore was an arrogant know-it-all who continually reinvented himself, a serial exaggerator, the kind of boy who would remind the teacher that she had forgotten to assign homework. Any excuse to get that in there. But he says that likability is actually a pretty minor factor. He says Jimmy Carter's likability was the highest of all Democratic candidates between 1952 and 2000, even though his job approval was low. Reagan's likability in 1980 was lowest among Republicans. He makes the point that both JFK and Reagan actually revealed their charisma after they had been elected. So what do you think? Is it going to be likability, or is it going to be the economy this year with Obama?
Well, I think it's ultimately going to be the economy. Now, having said that, you can't have a candidate who is so unlikable and reviled that people aren't going to pay attention to what he says.
Right.
However, I think what's really important in modern times where we've seen candidates trip up is not so much likability, but when it doesn't appear that they know who they are and when they keep trying to reinvent themselves. And so I think given what Romney was able to accomplish in his convention last week, he at least appears to know who he is, and he is trying to just let people a little bit more into the private side of him, which is something you have to do. Now, having said that, we know the president's a lot more likable, and a couple of really good jobs reports would help him.
Right.
If things stay the way they are, though, I still think it's a tight race, and people are going to make a decision based on how they feel about the economy and who they think would be a better leader in that regard going forward.
We've never seen a differential this large between the likability of the president and the unlikability, the underwater numbers for Romney. We've never seen a major party nominee as unliked as Romney is. So, I mean, this is a huge differential between these. And I want to throw in another statistic. In the last 5 elections, Gallup says the candidate with the greatest favorability rating, which may be slightly different than likability, you can unpack that for us, but the greatest favorability rating always wins the election in the last 5 elections. And we're talking about 4 of the last 5 presidents are basically rock stars to their fans, from Reagan, Clinton, Bush, and Obama. I think there is something to this likability thing, don't you think?
I think you're right in terms of personal favorability. And as we know with presidents who are facing tough economic headwinds or political headwinds, what I watch for is not so much the job approval, which I think a president can get reelected at around 47, 48%, maybe even 46, but does their personal favorability stay above 50%? And the minute you're at 50% and below favorability as a president, it means that you may be on the verge of losing the American people altogether. We saw that happen with the president's predecessor, Mr. Bush. When the country was finished with him, his personal faves, which had always been high, dipped below 50%, and they never recovered. And so there is something to that. The one thing we don't know, and what we really haven't seen in these last 5 presidents, is we haven't seen a president running for re-election with 8.3% unemployment, economic growth potentially clocking in at 2% or less, and a huge underemployment population. So it's really, in a sense, we're in uncharted waters.
Let me try to take this from a slightly different angle, because I think there's something that likability might be sort of related to, and that is the length of time that a person or his party have controlled the White House. This is Obama's first term, and I think there's a tendency, and some political scientists have done some research to back this up. There is a tendency to like an incumbent more when it's the first term and when it's his party's first term, and to not want to give up on that incumbent or that party. So you look at, like, George Bush Sr. in 1992 was still in some ways a generally likable guy, but it had been 12 years of Republican rule at that point, and you had high unemployment, you had economic anxiety, and so there was this attitude of, let's just give up on this guy, let's just give up on his party, and there's more of an openness to change. Whereas right now, you've got somebody coming in, and it's only been 4 years, it's only been 1 term, and there's clearly likability there. So I wonder if maybe that's what this is. It's a point or two, it's worth a point or two there, people who just don't want to give up this soon.
Well, there is something to that to this degree as well. I think for Republicans, we've seen a lot of unrest within the party over the last year, and I think a lot of that, Steve, has to do with the fact that they haven't been out of power that long. If Mitt Romney doesn't win this election, I think whoever the Republicans nominate in 4 years, you're going to see a lot more unity, simply for the fact that they are going to be so hungry to get back into the White House. And when you've only been out for 4 years and you're not quite happy with how your party conducted itself when you were in power, you're not missing it in the way that you would otherwise, and you're not willing to put everything else aside for victory. What you're still thinking about is what kind of victory. If the Republicans don't win this time, 4 years from now, it's going to be anything. We'll put aside everything to get to victory, and we'll worry about it later.
David, is there a clear historical precedent for the less likable, like clearly less likable candidate to win at the presidential level?
I'm not sure. We have seen candidates who generally aren't that likable or engaging or dynamic win. I mean, Richard Nixon was not a beacon of political inspiration. George Herbert Walker Bush was very competent and capable, but nobody swooned over him. And it was always, you remember the vision thing. Steve will probably remember this because he's good with that stuff.
Of course he does. He definitely does.
It was always, he had the vision deficit and 1,000 points of light, and we used to joke about it. And George W. Bush, who was personally very engaging, still couldn't put 3 sentences together in the 2000 campaign and wasn't very articulate. And Al Gore, who wasn't the most likable guy in the world and didn't know who he was and was constantly trying to reinvent himself, he won the popular vote, even though he didn't win the election. And so there is plenty of precedent for not the most likable, engaging, inspirational candidate winning the presidency, winning big races. It's possible it could happen this time. It's a matter of where voters are over the next 6 weeks.
Guys, I just want to add for 30 seconds, because Drucker just made me think of something. He mentioned Nixon, and it occurs to me, yeah, Nixon won in 1968, and the nickname of the guy he beat, Hubert Humphrey, the Happy Warrior. So I guess there might be a precedent there.
There you go. Okay, David Drucker.